This is the first video in a series of videos I'm going to be doing over the course of this independent study where I break down what I've been learning about. I've come up with a system of 4 points that I feel like is going to work, and if it doesn't, I can change it. I'm okay with that too. But I want to make it as cohesive and understandable as possible, just for the fact that I'd like if my mom were to watch this video, and she probably will because I want to show it to her, or if my 13-year-old cousin was watching this video, either one of them could understand what I'm talking about without completely knowing the topic or the subject totally, right? So the first thing that I want to do is a check-in, how I felt over the past few weeks in regards to the reading, and also how I'm feeling mentally too, because my mental health affects all aspects of my life. How I absorb readings and how I absorb knowledge is absolutely tied to how I feel mentally. Two, what I've been reading. I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page and that I can also come back to this as a reference, right? Three, how I feel about it. What stuck out, what impacts me. What impacts me is going to be different than what impacts somebody else that's reading the same exact type of literature that I am, right? But obviously this is my paper and this is my perspective, and it's important that I talk about how it makes me feel. Four, how it will impact my paper, because ultimately that's the end goal, right? But also I want to be able to use these videos as a resource past this course, because this is important to my life and important to my future studies as well. Now, with that out the way, we can get started. So, I started off with Dawn Duke's Literary Passion. I'm not totally sure why I chose that in particular as my first reading. It just stuck out to me. Now, she talks about something called gender consciousness among women writers. What I personally interpreted that as was understanding that I'm a woman and understanding that being a woman is going to affect how I view the world naturally. Now, that might seem like a very simple concept to understand, but there are definitely people, men and women, that don't actually factor that into their lives. Now, she also talks about something called the written object being turned into the written subject. That's super important to my writing and to Caribbean writing in general, for the fact that women writers have decided that I am no longer going to be the accessory. I am no longer going to be in the background of the story. I am going to be the story. The story is me. That's extremely important. That's going to impact my writing too, because that shows the difference between when a man is writing about me and what I am writing about myself, because who knows me better than me? Then who knows me? It makes sense in my head. I know myself better than anybody else. There. That's it. Okay. So, when I was reading this particular writing, what stuck out and the question that I kept asking myself is, what do we learn from writing filled with racial hierarchy? Racial hierarchy and the writings that coincide, they affect how I feel about myself, right? They create a distorted image of who I am. And they've been doing that for centuries. That is exactly how we get into things like slavery, right? When you can change the way a person feels about themselves and you can change the way they feel about people around them, ultimately you can control them. Now, somebody else reading this particular writing or the writings that I read this week may not feel like that is, they may not feel like it's as intense as I'm saying it is, but it definitely is. Now, when I read Pedagogies of Crossing, what I got out of that was that there's a quote that's really important, and it says, "I have deliberately chosen to interrupt inherited boundaries of geography, nation, and identity that distort vision so that they can be replaced with frameworks and modes, being that enable an understanding of the dialects of history," right? So what I interpreted that as is the significance of having Caribbean women writers and the significance of doing the research on Caribbean women writers, because the way we view ourselves ultimately changes and ultimately affects the way we view the world too. And when you have somebody else telling your narrative, it's going to affect you. Whether or not you realize it up front and in your face, it's going to affect you. Now, in Oshun's Daughter, they talk about something called a defining characteristic of postmodernism in the fragmentation, or the notion that there is no knowable, integrated, united self. Instead, there is the splintered subject, each piece of the self coexisting without any need to make these fragments come together in a cohesive sense. This is really important too, because we need, in writing, going into things and reading it as a Black woman, I need to understand that I am not Black without being a woman. I am not a woman without being Black. Both of these pieces of me are consistently interacting. I am not one without the other. It's important for that to be reflected in the writing that I'm reading too, because again, it goes back to, it changes how I view myself. These readings that I did this week were really important. And I feel like a lot of the time with theory, we can get very swept up in the language and get very confused, and almost to the point where we no longer want to do it because it's complicated, right? And even sometimes these writings, when you read them, can make you uncomfortable. But what I've been learning throughout my life too is that discomfort brings change. And the metaphor, or the example I always use when I explain it to my friends, is that if I sit on my leg for too long and I start to feel that little staticky pins and needles feelings, I'm going to change my position, right? Now, if we read things that make us uncomfortable and show us things about ourselves that we didn't even know existed, we're going to change too. And most of the time, it's going to be for the better. So I'm going to keep reading things like this. Even though sometimes it does make me uncomfortable because we have to tap into a place that we didn't think we would have to, it's important. Next week, I think I'm going to dive deeper into these topics too with the next readings. That's going to be when I do another one of these in 2 weeks. I enjoyed making this. I'm excited to continue. I can already tell that my paper is going to be impactful on me, but it's also going to be impactful on other people too, because this is important. This is a part of my life, and this is a part of a lot of other people's lives too. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.